In the fading light of the western sun, a young cowboy rides into a land that does not welcome strangers. There, beneath the red cliffs of Serpent's Coil, he meets a proud tribe and the chief's beautiful daughter, whose eyes hold both danger and desire. Before we begin the story, comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Part 1. The Stranger's Binding. The sun, a dying ember, bled low over Serpent's Coil Canyon, casting long, cruel shadows, and turning every scrub brush into a silhouette of menace. Jedediah Stone's boots dragged through the parched earth, each step a testament to his fading strength. Every breath rasped, a raw protest in the suffocating heat. Behind him, the relentless thunder of hooves grew louder, a drumbeat of doom. Marius Vane's marauders. 13 hardened souls, their reputations forged in blood, hunting one broken drifter. His Winchester, a cold comfort, weighed heavy in his calloused hands. 12 bullets, no more. He braced himself, ready to make his last stand at a dry, cracked waterhole, prepared to trade his life for a bitter, costly measure of theirs. Then, from the deceptive shadows of the towering yuccas, 8 painted warriors of the desert dwellers rose, silent as ghosts. Their bows were drawn taut, carbines leveled with unwavering precision. For the first time in weeks, Jedediah Stone was not utterly, terrifyingly alone. The valley, moments later, was steeped in a thick, acrid haze of smoke and echoing gunfire. When the last shot finally faded into the distant cliffs, the desert air carried only the metallic tang of powder and the sharp, salty scent of sweat. Jedediah staggered, disbelief warring with the ragged certainty that he still drew breath upon the scarred ground. The Whisperwind River shimmered faintly in the distance, its rare, life-giving waters winding like a serpent through a canyon of fiery red stone and colossal cacti. The land itself felt both utterly merciless and vibrantly alive, sunlight striking sharp across unforgiving ridges, the wind dragging grit over exposed skin, the solitary cry of a hawk tearing through the sudden, fragile silence. He had known countless desolate places in his years of westward wandering, but none held the stark, primal power of this. Serpent's Coil was a valley of searing contrasts. Bone-dry earth, yet seamed with secret pools. Thorn-laden brush, hiding defiant blooms that burst forth in defiant reds and yellows. For the desert dwellers, who called it their sacred home, it was a sanctuary. For men like Jedediah, it was an unforgiving crucible. They led him into their camp with eyes of cautious inquiry, their weapons never far from immediate reach. The desert dweller settlement nestled along a gentle bend of the Whisperwind River, where ancient cottonwoods offered precious shade, and the air carried the faint, sweet perfume of mesquite smoke. Lodges fashioned from hide and stone blended seamlessly with the earth itself, so that from a distance, the entire camp appeared born directly from the desert's embrace. Children, mid-game, paused to stare with wide, curious eyes, while women carried water jars with an ancient, quiet dignity. At the very heart of the camp stood Kalen, the elder. His hair was a cascade of silver, his face etched deep with the indelible seasons of sun and profound loss. In his gaze flickered both sorrow and resolute strength, as though he bore not only his people's immediate burdens, but the memory of untold centuries. Jedediah sensed at once the immense weight of judgment there. He was not welcomed as kinsman, but neither was he dismissed as a clear enemy. Ragnar, the formidable war leader who had guided the warriors into battle, carried himself like the honed edge of a drawn blade, sharp, fiercely proud, unyielding. It was clear the young fighters looked to him with profound reverence. His suspicion toward Jedediah was stark, unambiguous. Every piercing glance measured whether this drifter was truly worth the precious blood spilled in saving him. And then there was Lyra. She did not immediately step forward, yet Jedediah noticed her at the periphery of the firelight, tall, poised, with long, raven-black hair that glinted where strands were bound with slivers of silver. Her eyes were deep and remarkably steady, watching without explicit judgment, but never without a profound depth of thought. She was younger than he had expected, barely past 20, but something in her bearing spoke of an education and a quiet, formidable purpose. It struck Jedediah as profoundly odd that she seemed to belong both to this wild desert and to some other unseen world beyond it. As night spread its cold, inexorable fingers over the valley, Jedediah sat by their fire, the crushing weight of exhaustion pressing him into the earth. For the first time in years, he did not sleep alone beneath an indifferent sky. Yet, in the deep hush of the camp, a stark truth settled within him. Sheer survival had brought him here. But destiny, a force far greater than any man, would ultimately decide if he could truly remain. Jedediah Stone awoke to the low, rhythmic thrum of drums. They were not the thunderous, heart-pounding beats of war, but slow, deliberate, like a persistent heart, reminding itself to keep time. He pushed himself up from the woven mat where they had laid him, the rawhide walls of the lodge glowing a warm, ethereal orange from the firelight just outside. The raw aches of yesterday's brutal battle still gripped his limbs, but sharper, more insistent than any wound, was the gnawing question, asterisk. Why had they saved him? Asterisk. When he stepped out, the entire camp was gathered in a vast, solemn circle. The desert-dweller warriors stood proud, their painted faces stark and solemn in the flickering flames. Women, their braids heavy with beads, watched with silent intensity, their children clutching tightly to their skirts. At the very center, Kalen raised a staff, intricately carved with symbols of clan and spirit. His voice, low and resonant, rolled over his people like the enduring current of the Whisperwind River. Though Jedediah did not understand the intricate words, their sheer weight pressed into his chest. Beside Kalen stood Ragnar, tall and tense, his hawk-like gaze fixed intently on Jedediah, as though daring him to falter. Around them, the warriors who had fought beside him just last night bore the same complex look, a blend of raw curiosity and deep, abiding suspicion. He could feel their unspoken question hanging in the air. Asterisk. Was this stranger a nascent brother, or a hidden danger waiting to turn against them? Asterisk. Then Kalen spoke, his English halting and strained, words hard-shaped by a tongue not raised to them. You fought with my sons. You bled with them. The spirit saw. He paused, his staff striking the earth with a resonant thud. You are not enemy. You are gift. Jedediah shifted, deeply uneasy. He had been called many things in his life: drifter, outlaw, survivor, but never gift. From behind the elder, a figure moved with fluid grace. She stepped into the very center of the circle, with a calm so profound it seemed to part the firelight itself. Lyra. Her name rippled across the gathering as though it carried its own inherent power. Jedediah's breath caught in his throat. She was dressed in a deerskin dress, richly worked with turquoise and quill, her hair flowing like black water over her shoulders. Silver flashed at her temples, where small clasps caught the fire's glow. But it was her eyes that truly held him. Dark, intelligently profound, unwavering. They regarded him not as a man to fear nor to admire, but as one whose very soul must be measured. Jedediah felt himself straighten under that intense gaze, as if stripped bare of all pretense. Kalen extended his hand toward her. "This is my daughter, Lyra," he announced. "She will be your wife." The words struck Jedediah harder than any bullet. Murmurs rippled through the camp, some approving, others sharp with undisguised surprise. He froze, unsure if he had simply misheard, but the solemn faces all around him confirmed it was no jest. His voice cracked, dry from disbelief. "I didn't ask for—" Ragnar stepped forward, his posture like a gathering storm, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife, taut with fury. "You dare refuse what is given? You think yourself above us?" His words, though spoken in their native tongue, carried a stinging contempt Jedediah understood well enough. Lyra raised her hand, silencing Ragnar without needing to exert any physical force. Her voice came, clear and strong, touched with an accent yet perfectly fluent. "It is not refusal," she said, her gaze fixed on Jedediah but speaking to the entire assembly. "It is confusion. The white man does not know our ways." Her tone was neither warm nor hostile. It was exact, precise. She was interpreting him as one might a complex text, giving no more and no less than the absolute truth. Jedediah swallowed, meeting her eyes. For the very first time, he sensed not just beauty, but a profound, unyielding authority, the quiet command of someone who carried her people's collective memory and their uncertain future alike. Kalen's staff struck the earth again. "You saved my people from death. We give you life in return. You are bound now. Her hand is your tether. With it, you belong." The fire crackled in the heavy silence that followed. Jedediah felt the crushing weight of every eye upon him. Part of him longed to simply laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. He who had lost everything, offered a wife by utter strangers. Yet another part, deeper and far quieter, stirred with something he could not yet name. For years, he had walked alone, chasing ghosts across endless deserts. Now, for reasons utterly beyond his choosing, he was no longer untethered. When the gathering finally dispersed, Lyra approached him. She moved with the distinct grace of someone raised between two disparate worlds. Her steps light as desert sand, her bearing as straight and poised as any woman from Santa Fe's elite schools. She stopped within arm's reach, her gaze steady, unwavering. "You do not have to like this," she said softly, her English precise, tinged with a faint cadence of Spanish. "But you must respect it. My father has spoken. To refuse is to shame him. To accept is to protect more than just yourself." Jedediah met her eyes, searching for a hidden meaning. "And what of you? Did you choose this?" Her expression shifted, a fleeting flicker of something unreadable passing through her deep eyes. "I choose my people," she said at last, her voice firm. "That is all I have ever chosen." She turned, leaving him with words that felt both like a protective shield and a sharp blade. Jedediah stood, watching the gentle sway of her braid as she vanished into the deep shadows, the firelight painting her silhouette against the canyon walls. For the first time since arriving in Serpent's Coil, Jedediah realized the war he had stumbled into was not only of bullets and spilled blood, it was a war of belonging, of survival, of hearts bound where they had no wish to be bound. And in the very center of it all stood a woman whose unwavering gaze he could not shake, whose fate was now inextricably entwined with his own. Part 2. The Unspoken Language. The days that followed settled like dust over Serpent's Coil Canyon, slow, fine, and persistent. If survival in this place was a craft, then its first lesson was patience. Jedediah Stone learned it not through words, but by enduring heat, silence, and the soft rhythm of a world that had existed long before he came stumbling into it. Each dawn, the camp stirred quietly. Smoke rose from the cooking fires in pale blue ribbons, carrying the sweet scent of mesquite and roasted corn. Women knelt by the grinding stones, their shoulders moving to a rhythm that belonged to time itself. Children ran barefoot through the dust, their laughter scattering like seeds in the wind. The men spoke little, only short, practical words about tracks, herds, or rain. It wasn't noise, but a kind of music born of labor and belonging. Jedediah stood at the edges of this song, listening. He told himself it was to learn their ways, but in truth, it was because the sound of people living filled something hollow in him. Lyra was his teacher, unyielding but fair. She treated his ignorance as a burden that could be lifted, not pitied. When his snares slipped loose, she took his hands, cool and steady, and adjusted his grip. "Too tight," she said, pulling the rawhide until it whispered. "If the loop sings, the rabbit hears it." When he failed to spot water in a cracked riverbed, she crouched and touched the sand, showing him a faint shimmer of damp beneath. "The desert hides what it doesn't want to give," she told him. "You must see with more than your eyes." Her tone carried neither cruelty nor kindness, only truth, and Jedediah listened. He'd come from a world where survival meant coin and rifle, where land yielded if you forced it. Here, nothing yielded. Every sip of water, every breath of shade, was earned through respect. The canyon demanded humility and gave peace only to those who learned its language. Their days fell into rhythm. He worked beside her, fetching branches, setting traps, mending torn hide. She showed him the sweetness inside cactus fruit, how to read wind from the tilt of a raven's flight. In return, he taught her small things: how to mend a saddle strap, how to sharpen a knife with slow patience instead of force. They spoke little, yet the silence between them grew comfortable. One evening, as the fire painted her face in gold and shadow, Jedediah said, "You weren't always here." Lyra's hands stilled. "Santa Fe," she said at last. "The sisters taught me letters, Spanish, English. I learned the ways of towns. And why come back? Because letters do not stop soldiers. Prayers do not keep land." She looked into the fire. "Here, I am needed." He understood more than she said. Both of them had become bridges between past and present, hope and survival. Neither had chosen the burden. Days passed. He slipped while climbing a ridge, and her hand caught his wrist, strong and sure. When a rattlesnake coiled near her path, his rifle cracked once, and silence returned. Neither thanked the other. Neither needed to. Each understood that gratitude, here, was expressed in the act itself. As the weeks lengthened, the camp began to shift around him. Children stopped staring and started waving. Warriors greeted him with curt nods, the kind a man gave another who carried his own weight. For Jedediah, the feeling of belonging was at once comforting and terrifying. He had spent years moving through life, like a shadow, free but unseen. Now, people looked for him at dusk, asked for his help, counted his presence as part of their days. It was a strange, fragile tether, and he feared how easily it might break. One night, while they watched sparks rise into the cool dark, he spoke without thinking. "Back east, I had a family. Fever took them all. I left because there was nothing left to hold." Lyra's eyes softened. From her pouch, she drew a small carved bird. "My mother sang to the fire before each hunt," she said. "When she died, I kept her voice in this." She placed it briefly in his palm, letting him feel its warmth before taking it back. "We both carry ghosts," he nodded. "Maybe that's why the living find each other." The silence that followed was not heavy, it was shared. Autumn came with cooler winds, and the canyon's colors deepened to amber and rust. Lyra taught him how to read clouds, how to feel the nearness of rain in the air. He watched her work, each movement exact, her expression calm and deliberate, as if she belonged to the same law that governed the stars. One afternoon, they walked beside the Whisperwind River, its voice a low murmur through reeds and stone. "Do you ever wish for more?" he asked quietly. "A life without fear, without soldiers?" Lyra paused, watching the light flicker on the current. "Wanting doesn't change the desert," she said. "You learn to live with what's given, or you drown wishing." Her words lingered like the echo of thunder over distant cliffs. The days grew shorter. The nights came cold and crystalline. When a sandstorm swept through the valley, they huddled together with Kalen's kin inside a hide lodge, the air thick with grit. Lyra soothed a frightened child, counting softly in her native tongue until the wind's howl became just another rhythm to endure. When the storm passed, the camp stepped into sunlight again, scoured clean, stronger for having bent and not broken. Ragnar, the war leader, watched Jedediah closely. He said little, but his silences were tests. A hoofprint. How many? 2, 1 lame. A ridge. Shade at noon or at 3. 3. Ragnar nodded once and moved on. Among the desert dwellers, approval was never spoken. It was earned in small accuracies. By then, Jedediah had stopped thinking of leaving. He rose when they rose, worked when they worked, rested when they rested. He fetched water without being asked, mended what was broken before it worsened. He no longer counted days, only tasks, seasons, and faces. One evening, frost silvered the riverbank. Lyra fastened a strap across a water skin, her fingers quick and precise. Jedediah watched the faint mist of her breath and said, "If I'm tied to you by duty, know that I don't resent the rope." Her eyes met his, dark and still. "It isn't a rope," she said. "It's a path. You can walk away if you choose." "I know." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "But this one goes where my feet wish to go." The corners of her lips softened, not quite a smile, but not far from it. That night, the camp sang old songs to call in the first frost. The drums were gentle, almost shy, as if afraid to disturb the cold air. Jedediah sat by the fire, feeling the pulse of it move through the ground, through him. He realized that the loneliness he'd carried for years had quieted, not gone, but softened, made bearable by the rhythm of others' hearts nearby. As winter edged closer, the lessons continued. He learned to tell when a hawk cried warning rather than hunger, when the air before dawn meant snow. Lyra taught him the difference between silence born of thought and silence born of doubt. He began to speak her tongue not fluently, but enough that the children laughed when he stumbled and clapped when he got it right. And through it all, something unnamed took root between them. It wasn't yet love. It was something smaller, steadier. The trust of two people who had bled, worked, and endured side by side. He began to dream again, not of escape, but of staying, of building something that could last longer than fear. One night, beneath a sky brittle with stars, he found Lyra by the river. She stood still, listening to the water's endless murmur. The charm she'd given him hung warm against his chest. "If your mother's spirits are listening," he said softly, "tell them I'm grateful." She looked at him, the firelight from distant lodges glinting in her eyes. "They hear," she said, "and they wait to see if you will stay." That ear. He didn't answer, but when she turned to go, he followed. In the weeks that followed, Jedediah realized the camp no longer looked past him. It looked to him. His hands had learned the language of their work. His voice had found a place in their circle. He was no longer a ghost, moving through borrowed lives. He had become part of the breath of the valley. When Lyra met his eyes across the fire and did not look away, he understood. What had grown between them was not yet love, but it was something love could trust. And in Serpent's Coil Canyon, under the whispering sky and the watchful moon, that was enough. For the first time in many years, enough felt like everything. Part 3. The Serpent's Tongue. The first warning came with the dust, a thin veil on the horizon, too steady to be wind, too broad to be buffalo. By midday, a scout galloped into camp, his face tight with urgency. "Soldiers," he shouted, his voice a whip crack across the still air. "The blue coats!" Jedediah Stone stood beside Ragnar, the war leader's gaze hardening into flint, as the news spread like a wildfire among the lodges. Men gripped their weapons, their faces grim. Women clutched their children closer, their murmurs a rising tide of dread. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, suffocating. Even before the scout finished his breathless report, Jedediah knew who led them. He had heard the name whispered like a curse in dusty saloons, a grim legend of the plains, Lieutenant Colonel Silas Whitmore, the scourge of the southern plains, a man who believed the only good desert dweller was one driven onto reservation land, or buried beneath it. That evening, the council gathered around the fire, its flames dancing like frantic spirits in the deepening twilight. Kalen's staff marked the circle, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion and the crushing weight of prophecy. "The Bluecoats march," he said in his native tongue, his voice low but firm, resonating with the ancient wisdom of his people. "If they find us, they will burn the lodges, scatter our children, chain our men." The circle broke into a storm of argument. Warriors, young and fierce, demanded a strike. "Hit the soldiers in the canyon passes," one shouted, his fists shaking. "Bleed them before they reach the valley." Elders, their voices raspy with age, urged retreat. "Hide in the mountains as our ancestors did," they cried, gesturing towards the towering peaks. Voices clashed, a maelstrom of fear and defiance, sparks flying into the night sky like angry, untamed spirits. Jedediah felt the weight of their eyes on him. He was still a stranger, an outsider, yet he was also a man who had stood against enemies with them, who had bled beside their sons. They wanted to know, what would times say? Before he could speak, Lyra rose. The firelight caught her face, carving sharp shadows along her cheekbones, her eyes gleaming with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "If we fight, we are crushed," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the clamor. "If we flee, we are hunted. We need time. Time to prepare. Time to decide." Her gaze flicked to Jedediah, holding him captive. "He can give us that." Jedediah stiffened, a cold dread twisting in his gut. "Me?" She stepped closer, addressing the council, her words measured and precise. "The soldiers believe him one of their kind. He will go to them. Claim he was taken by us. Claim he escaped. He will tell them lies that lead them astray." Ragnar spat into the dust, his disapproval a palpable force. "Risky," he growled. "If he fails, they return with more guns. More hatred." Lyra's jaw tightened, her eyes burning. "If we do nothing," she countered, her voice low but unyielding, "they return anyway. All of them." All eyes turned to Jedediah again. He had been many things in his life: cowhand, drifter, deserter, survivor, but never a savior. The thought of walking willingly into Whitmore's hands made his stomach twist with revulsion. Yet when he looked at Lyra, he saw no fear, only a steely certainty, and he remembered her words spoken just weeks ago. Asterisk. "To accept is to protect more than just yourself." Asterisk. Slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, though his insides churned with a mixture of terror and resolve. "But I'll need to look the part." So they made him into a ghost of a prisoner. Lyra approached him, her hands deft and unhesitating. She cut jagged lines into his shirt, stained the fabric with ash and dirt from the fire. She smeared red clay on his skin, leaving him bruised in appearance, his face a mask of suffering. With a small, sharp knife, she nicked his hair unevenly, strands falling into the crackling flames. Her touch was professional, distant, yet utterly intimate. When she stepped back, her eyes lingered on him, softer than before, a fleeting vulnerability in their depths. "Take this," she whispered, pressing a small leather pouch into his palm. "My mother's charm for protection. It watches over those who walk into danger." Jedediah closed his fingers around it, the weight of the charm, oddly, profoundly grounding. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra met his gaze, her dark eyes solemn. "Then at least," she said, her voice a promise in the darkness, "you will not walk alone." The next morning, under a white cloth tied to a gnarled branch, a flag of desperate surrender, Jedediah stumbled toward the advancing column. The clatter of hooves and the jangle of sabers filled the crisp desert air long before the soldiers themselves came into view, dust rising behind them like storm clouds. At their head rode Whitmore, tall in his saddle, his mustache waxed to cruel points, his eyes pale and cold as the winter sky. He raised a gloved hand, halting his men as Jedediah collapsed before them, feigning utter exhaustion. "Good God," one soldier muttered, his voice hoarse. "It's a white man." Whitmore dismounted, his boots crunching gravel. He loomed over Jedediah, suspicion sharpening his already severe features. "Name yourself." "Jedediah Stone," he croaked, forcing a tremor into his voice. "Prospector, out of Santa Fe." He coughed, letting dust and manufactured weakness steal his breath. "They took me weeks ago. I barely escaped." Whitmore's gaze pierced him, cold and measuring. "Where is their camp?" Jedediah swallowed, choosing his lies with the precision of a practiced gambler. "In the cliffs east of the Whisperwind River, Colonel. Tunnels, caves, dozens of them. I slipped away when they drank. Too much." He lifted his head just enough to let desperation show in his eyes. "Please, Colonel, don't go near the river. Too many. You'll be slaughtered," the men muttered, shifting uneasily in their saddles. Fear was a contagious thing, and Jedediah fed it with every rasping breath, every staggered movement. Whitmore studied him for a long moment, then barked an order. "Give him water. Put him on a mule. We march east at dawn." Relief threatened to buckle Jedediah's knees. He had bought the desert dwellers time, but he also knew Whitmore's suspicion was not fully eased. The colonel's pale eyes lingered on him, as though sensing the falsehood beneath his words. A subtle discord in his carefully crafted performance. By nightfall, under cover of darkness, Jedediah slipped away from the encampment, his lungs burning and his legs trembling from the exertion of his escape. When he stumbled back into the Serpent's Coil Valley, Lyra was waiting, a silent sentinel in the gloom. She did not smile, but her eyes glistened, reflecting the distant stars as she pressed the charm, still clutched in his fist, back into his palm. "You returned," she whispered, her voice thick with a relief she rarely allowed herself to show. But the triumph, fragile as it was, soared quickly and then vanished. Within days, scouts brought word, grim and devastating. Whitmore had doubled back. Now, with a force of 70 men, he had seen through the ruse. The valley shook with a palpable fear. Warriors sharpened their blades, their movements stiff with unspoken dread. Elders wailed prayers to the desert spirits. Children clung to their mothers, their faces tear-stained. In the council, fires glowed, but despair pressed down heavier than the desert night itself. The brutal choice loomed over them: fight and perish, flee and scatter, or gamble on something unheard of, something desperately improbable. Peace. And once again, it was Lyra's voice that rose above the clamor, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Part 4. The Path of Whispers. The council fire burned low, its embers glowing like scattered stars across the sand. Men argued in harsh bursts, their voices raw with fear and anger. Women murmured prayers to the desert spirits, their faces etched with despair. But over it all, the elder Kalen's silence carried the heaviest weight. He sat unmoving, eyes shut, as if listening to voices older than any present. At last he lifted his staff, and the clamor stilled, falling into a profound, aching hush. "We stand at the edge of fire," he said, his voice raspy with ancient wisdom. "One path burns quickly, the other burns slow, but burn we must." Into the hush, Lyra rose. Her face shone with a fine sheen of sweat, but her voice carried steady, cutting through the heavy air with an unexpected force. "There is a third path," she said, turning slowly towards Jedediah Stone, her eyes a beacon of unwavering resolve in the dim light. "We ask for words, not blood. He will carry them." A ripple went through the circle, a gasp of disbelief. Ragnar bristled, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his knife, his body taut with outrage. "You would hand our lives to a drifter?" he growled, his voice thick with contempt. "He is no son of this valley." Lyra's gaze cut to him, sharp as obsidian, silencing his protest with its sheer intensity. And yet he stood with us, lied for us, risked his life while others only argued. She turned back to Jedediah, her tone softening, though its core remained firm. He is not desert dweller, but he is not enemy either. He can speak where we cannot. Jedediah felt every eye in the circle burn into him, 100 judgments and hopes pressing down on his shoulders. His throat tightened, dry as the desert floor. He had never been chosen for anything but exile, for hardship, for loss. Yet here was trust, offered like a blade, dangerous to take, more dangerous to refuse. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning in his gut. "But only if I go as more than a mouthpiece. If I speak for myself as well. My life's tied to yours now." Lyra's lips parted, the faintest curve hinting at a relief so profound it seemed to shimmer in the firelight. That night, beneath the ancient cottonwoods by the Whisperwind River, she sought him out. The moon, a sliver of silver in the vast sky, turned her deerskin dress to pale moonlight, her hair dark as the river's current. For a long moment, neither spoke, only listened to the soft, ceaseless whisper of water sliding over stone. "You did not have to accept," she said at last, her voice barely a murmur above the river. She stepped closer, her hand brushing the small leather pouch she had given him, still tied at his neck. "My mother's charm was meant to keep me safe," she whispered, her voice fragile with emotion. "I gave it to you, and you came back. Perhaps the spirits listen." Their eyes met, and something unspoken bridged the space between them, fragile, dangerous, but undeniable. Jedediah reached for her hand, his calloused fingers trembling as they touched hers. She did not pull away. The next day, preparations began with a quiet, solemn urgency. Jedediah rehearsed his words, testing phrases in both English and Spanish, while Lyra guided his tongue. She was exacting, correcting his tone until each sentence rang with the dignity of a people facing annihilation. "Do not beg," she warned, her voice sharp with steel. "Speak as equal. Soldiers respect strength, not supplication." Meanwhile, the camp shifted. Warriors sharpened their blades, not for attack, but for a last, desperate defense. Elders gathered their sacred bundles, ready to flee into the unforgiving mountains if talks failed. Children watched Jedediah with wide, solemn eyes, whispering as though he were a spirit caught between worlds, destined to walk a path no ordinary man could survive. On the morning of his departure, Jedediah strapped his Winchester across his back, though he knew he must not raise it. Lyra approached him, fastening a strip of white cloth, a flag of desperate diplomacy, to his arm. Her fingers lingered longer than strictly necessary, a fleeting touch of warmth against his skin. "Remember," she murmured, her voice low, "you carry more than yourself. You carry our last chance." Jedediah met her gaze, his own eyes holding a new, fierce resolve. "And I carry you." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a heartbeat, the warrior's daughter seemed simply a woman, torn between the crushing weight of duty and a stirring she could not yet name. Then she straightened, resolve returning to her like steel beneath silk. As Jedediah mounted the borrowed horse, the people gathered in silence, their faces a canvas of hope and dread. Some gave blessings, others muttered their doubts. Only Lyra stepped close enough for him to hear, her voice a fierce low vow against the wind. "Come back to me." With that, Jedediah rode toward Whitmore's camp, the horizon burning with the sunrise behind him. The valley waited, fragile as glass, and before him loomed a gamble that could shatter or save them all. For 3 days the talks dragged like a wounded animal, bleeding hope into the dust. Jedediah stood between Whitmore's steel-eyed soldiers and the desert dweller delegation, his voice raw from translating demands and denials, his spirit frayed by the constant tension. Whitmore, unyielding, wanted surrender, submission, proof of victory. The desert dwellers, tenacious as the desert itself, wanted their land, their breath, the right to live as they always had. Each word exchanged seemed to build a wall higher than the last. But Jedediah did not break. He spoke not as a drifter or an outcast, but as a man tethered to both worlds. He reminded Whitmore of treaties broken, of blood already spilled, of the futility of endless war. He reminded the desert dwellers that survival sometimes meant bending so that the roots remained. His words carried not eloquence, but grit, shaped by nights of dust and loss, and by the unwavering faith reflected in Lyra's steady eyes. On the final evening, under a sun sinking red into the Serpent's Coil Valley, Whitmore signed a fragile accord. The desert dwellers would keep part of their sacred land, their lodges and fields spared. In return, they swore not to raid beyond their borders. It was peace born of exhaustion, tenuous as a spider's thread, but peace nonetheless. When Jedediah returned to camp, Lyra was waiting, a silent sentinel in the firelight. The flickering flames touched her face, and for once she smiled, not the careful mask of duty, but a smile that reached her deep, intelligent eyes. "You came back," she whispered, her voice thick with wonder. "I promised," he answered simply. Months later, spring broke across the valley. Wildflowers, defiant and beautiful, pushed through cracks in the red earth, their colors stubborn against the dust. Lyra cradled a newborn girl in her arms, swaddled in soft deerskin. Jedediah stood beside her, his eyes damp as he brushed a finger across his daughter's impossibly soft cheek. Elena Stone, two worlds bound in one small, breathing body, living proof that love could grow even in the harshest soil. Around them, the camp sang, voices rising with the rhythmic thrum of drums. Not for battle, but for joy. For the first time, Jedediah felt the valley was no longer a place of exile, but of home. And when the winds swept through the cottonwoods, scattering petals like prayers, Jedediah knew the Serpent's Coil would remember this moment, not for battles fought, but for the fragile bloom of hope planted in its ancient dust. Part 5. The Enduring Bloom. The sun, as it always did, continued its endless dance over Serpent's Coil Canyon. But now, its golden light seemed to touch the red rock with a different grace. It warmed the lodges of hide and stone, illuminated the laughing faces of children, and gilded the silver strands in Kalen's hair. Jedediah Stone watched it all, standing by the Whisperwind River, the gentle current murmuring tales of time. He was no longer the broken drifter who had stumbled into this valley, driven by fear and the thunder of hooves. The scars of his past remained, etched deep within his soul, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They had become the silent testimonies of a man reborn, a man who had found not just survival, but purpose, in the heart of a world he never expected to call home. His hands, once calloused from a rifle and a lariat, now knew the feel of a digging stick, the warmth of a child's impossibly soft cheek. His eyes, once always scanning for danger, now saw the subtle language of the desert, the promise of rain in a distant cloud, the track of a deer near a secret spring, the resilient beauty of a defiant wildflower. He had walked through fire, both literal and metaphorical, standing between two worlds, translating not just words, but wills, fears, and hopes. He had spoken of broken treaties and spilled blood to a man consumed by conquest, and of the enduring spirit of life to a people clinging to their very existence. The fragile accord Whitmore had signed was not a victory declared with trumpets, but a truce whispered into the wind, a tenuous thread woven with exhaustion, and a desperate, hard-won belief in a different path. And Lyra, her name, once a command, a promise, a challenge, now resonated within him with a profound tenderness. She was the anchor that had bound him, not with chains, but with the unbreakable cords of shared destiny and unwavering strength. She had seen through his hardened shell, not with judgment, but with an intelligent, discerning gaze that measured his soul. She had taught him to see with more than his eyes, to respect the desert's hidden truths, to understand that wanting did not change the landscape, but endurance could shape it. Her hands, which had once stained his shirt with ash and dirt to create a prisoner's disguise, now smoothed the hair from their daughter's brow. Her voice, once sharp with instruction, now hummed a soft, ancient lullaby. She was the embodiment of the valley itself, stark, beautiful, utterly unyielding, yet capable of nurturing the most precious life. She had carried the weight of her people's memory and their uncertain future, and in doing so, had carved out a future for them all. Their daughter, Elena Stone, was the living embodiment of that future. Her small, breathing body, swaddled in soft deerskin, was a testament to the impossible. Two worlds, once defined by conflict, now converged in the innocent flicker of her eyes. She was the seed of hope, planted in the harshest soil, a fragile bloom that had pushed through the cracks in the red earth. Her laughter, yet to come, would one day echo through the canyon, a melody woven from the old songs of the desert dwellers and the quiet strength of her father's enduring spirit. The camp, once shadowed by dread, now resonated with the rhythmic thrum of drums, not for battle, but for joy, for celebration, for the simple, profound act of living. Each beat was a heartbeat for Elena, for Lyra, for Jedediah, for all who called Serpent's coil home. The peace they had forged was not an end to struggle, but a new beginning, a delicate balance that demanded constant vigilance and unending commitment. There would still be shadows, still be challenges, for the desert was a harsh mistress and the world beyond their canyon was ever-changing. But now they would face them together. Jedediah, once utterly alone, now walked surrounded by kinship. Lyra, once burdened by solitary purpose, now shared the future with a partner. The desert dwellers, once facing annihilation, now held on to their sacred land, their heritage, their future, with renewed hope. This story, like the winds that swept through the ancient cottonwoods, scattering petals like prayers, is a reminder. It reminds us that the Wild West, often painted in hues of relentless conflict and unyielding frontiers, was also a landscape where hearts dared to hope. It was a place where belonging was fought for, where love blossomed in unexpected places, and where courage was found not just in the roar of a gun, but in the quiet strength of a woman's gaze or the unwavering resolve of a man transformed by duty. It tells of the sacrifice required to build a bridge between disparate worlds, of the deep human yearning for connection, and the enduring power of a community that rises above division. Jedediah and Lyra's journey, culminating in the serene sight of their daughter Elena, reminds us that history is not merely a chronicle of battles, but a tapestry woven with countless individual stories of resilience, of unexpected alliances, and of the quiet triumph of the human spirit. It is a testament to the belief that even in the most unforgiving crucible, a family can be forged, a home can be found, and a new way forward can be illuminated. Thank you for walking beside Jedediah and Lyra through the dust of the Serpent's Coil Valley. Their story, and countless others like it, remind us that the frontier was not only guns and battles, but also love, sacrifice, and fragile hope. If this journey moved you, please consider sharing it. For each voice we elevate, each tale we tell, helps keep the true, complex spirit of this land alive. Join us as we continue to unearth these forgotten echoes, allowing them to bloom across the vast expanse of history, reminding us all that even in silence, there is profound power, and in shared stories, an enduring future. As the last rays of sunlight fade across the desert, the cowboy knows his journey is only beginning, not on the trail, but in the heart of those who once called him enemy. Love and fate ride the same wind in the Old West. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep the fire of the Old West stories burning bright.